All rise. Iowa District Court for Saragordo County is now in session. The Honorable Judge Christopher Foy presiding.
Thank you. Please be seated. Counsel, are we ready to have the jury brought in?
They are, Your Honor.
All right. Ms. Myrie? The rest of the courtroom may be seated. Good morning, jury. We're ready now to continue with presentation of the state's case. Mr. Hammerin or Mr. Dalen, you may call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state would call Dennis Kern to the stand.
Sir, if you'll step forward, please. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be giving the court will be the truth?
I do.
Thank you. You can have a seat. Mr. Hammerin?
Thank you. Please introduce yourself to the jury.
My name is Dennis James Kern, K-E-R-N.
Where do you work?
I work for the Division of Criminal Investigation, Criminalistics Laboratory in Ankeny, Iowa.
What's your title there?
I'm a criminalist.
And what section do you work in?
I work in the impressions section of the laboratory. We compare fingerprint evidence, palm print evidence, barefoot impressions, impressions from shoes or footwear, tire tracks, and we also do examinations of fracture matches, examining objects that are broken to determine if at one time they were part of the same object.
How long have you worked at the Division of Criminal Investigations Laboratory?
For 10 years.
Prior to working there, where did you work?
I worked for the Davenport Police Department in Davenport, Iowa.
When you left, what was your title there?
When I left, I was the Deputy Commander of the Services Division. I was a lieutenant for the Davenport Police Department.
Did you also work with impressions or latent prints when you were working for the Davenport Police Department?
Yes, sir. I worked in the Identification Bureau before becoming the commander of the Identification Bureau, and I ran the Identification Bureau from 1987 to 1998.
Mr. Kern, can you briefly go through your training in becoming a latent print examiner?
I was sent to the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy by the Davenport Police Department, and there I took the basic and advanced fingerprint schools, which were taught by the FBI. I was sent to the FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia, and I took the identification photography course, which is the photography of fingerprints. I took the administrative advanced fingerprint school for comparison of fingerprints. I've taken a number of other courses throughout the years that were, again, based on fingerprint comparisons. I conducted fingerprint comparisons for the Davenport Police Department, and I took the certification test from the International Association for Identification for certification as a fingerprint examiner in 1983, and I've maintained that ever since. I'm a lifetime member of the International Association for Identification. I'm also a lifetime member of the Iowa Division of the IAI, and for several years I was on the fingerprint subcommittee of the International Association for Identification.
Mr. Kern, are you a certified fingerprint examiner?
Yes, I am.
And what does it mean to be certified?
It means that you have completed the necessary coursework to achieve certification, that you have demonstrated technical capability of making comparisons correctly. The certification test requires that you complete 70% of the examination and comparisons with no mistakes. You're not allowed an error on the exam. Every year, the laboratory requires that we take proficiency examinations in the areas in which we work, and I have successfully completed all the proficiency examinations for the past 10 years.
Mr. Kern, I want to talk about some terms, if you could help define them for us. What is a latent print?
A latent print is associated with a fingerprint left behind on an article of evidence. Latent is from a Latin term meaning hidden, so generally fingerprints are not clearly visible on their own. You have to do some kind of a processing technique to make the fingerprint stand out in contrast with the background that it's on.
How about a patent print? What is a patent print?
A patent print is a three-dimensional print. It's the print left behind in another substance. If a person leaves a fingerprint in wet paint, you now have a three-dimensional representation of the fingerprint in the wet paint. Insulation materials, putties, oftentimes take that three-dimensional print. Prints left in grease are three-dimensional, but it's leaving the outline of the friction ridges on the skin in a three-dimensional object or a different media.
When you examine an item and you're looking for some type of latent or patent print, is every latent or patent print suitable for identification?
No, they're not.
What does it mean to be suitable for identification?
For suitable for identification, the print has to have enough ridge detail to be able to make, this varies throughout the day. You know, the amount of moisture in your fingers changes from time to time. Because what you're transferring is essentially water from your skin onto the surface. If the skin's dry, there's not much material, you don't leave behind a decent print. If it's an oily surface, sometimes the oil will just fill in and you don't get a decent, you don't get a good representation of the fingerprint because of the residual oil. The fingerprint can, again, you're back to where you've essentially smeared the fingerprint and you didn't allow a good contact of the ridges themselves.
Mr. Kern, in this case, did you examine a couple items?
Yes, I did.
First, I want to start with, did you examine what's been marked as States Exhibit 4 and 5, a tan case to a .44 revolver and a .44 revolver?
Yes, I did.
Starting with the tan case, States Exhibit number 5, the gun case, how did you examine that item for latent prints?
That was examined visually, looking at the outside, and what I was looking primarily for were patent prints or prints that were left behind by another media. The nature of that surface is such that it does not, you can't develop a fingerprint using normal fingerprinting techniques, and about the only thing you're going to get is a representation from the third substance.
And did you see anything on the gun case that was suitable for identification?
Nothing.
So does that mean no one ever touched the gun case?
No, it's just not suitable material for retaining a fingerprint.
Did you also look at the .44 revolver?
Yes, I did.
We're going to put a photograph up of States Exhibit 48, the .48 revolver. Prior to examining this for latent prints, did you do anything to get any potential DNA samples from it?
Those are collected prior to the rough surfaces of the firearm were processed, were collected, were swabbed for DNA, looking to see if any of this skin had sloughed off on those rougher surfaces. And then after that, then the gun was processed for latent prints.
Why is it important to do those swabs for potential DNA before you look at it for latent prints?
Our chemicals can interfere with retrieving DNA. We're going to, when we process the gun, one of our first techniques is to put it in a chamber with superglue fumes. The superglue fumes will plate out over the be polymerized over the areas where fingerprint detail would be. So the same areas that a person would touch and leave behind fingerprints are the same places that you would get DNA. And that super glue bonds with the surface. So it's very, very difficult to get that super glue off to get down to where there would possibly be any DNA. So for the most efficient way to do it is process the rough surfaces where fingerprints would not be likely to accumulate, and where skin cells would likely slough from the skin and collect on the gun. Do that first, and then we don't have a problem later on. It's kind of a binary. You can have DNA or you can have latent prints. It's very difficult to have both.
So after the gun was swabbed for potential DNA evidence on the rough surfaces, did you examine the .44 revolver for potential fingerprints?
Yes, I did.
Explain to the jury how the revolver was examined for fingerprints.
I used several techniques. The first was to visually look at the firearm to see if there was something that I could see and photograph without doing any additional processing. Nothing was in plain view, so the next thing I did was super glue processing, and nothing suitable for identification was developed with the super glue. The ridges will turn white against the black surface or the darker surfaces of the firearm. I used a dye stain on the firearm, a Rhodeman 6G dye stain, to try to dye the super glue to see if I could pick up additional ridge detail. And I did pick up detail on the cylinder, but it was not suitable. It wasn't suitable for identification. Following that, I used reflected ultraviolet imaging, which is where we use shortwave ultraviolet light as a source because it reflects differently than daylight. And what I was trying to do was improve the detail that had already been developed, but it never got to the point that there was enough detail and with sufficient clarity to be able to identify anything. So no fingerprints suitable for identification were ever developed on the pistol.
In the photographs, State's Exhibit 48 shows the .44 revolver. The actual revolver is in evidence, State's Exhibit 5. Through your chemical processing of the super glue and the dye stain, would that change the color in any way to the revolver?
Yes, if you see it today, it's going to look pink in color, and that's the result of the dye stain.
And you told us, Mr. Kern, you looked at the revolver, the .44 revolver, for any potential fingerprint. You did not find any suitable for identification. So again, does that mean no one ever touched this revolver?
No, sir. There's nothing there that was sufficient to be able to identify anyone.
Did you also look at a box of ammunition of .44 Remington Magnum?
It was .44 ammunition. It was manufactured by Federal, but it was the .44 Remington round. That's the caliber of the ammunition.
We're going to show a photograph, State's Exhibit 46, that it was already in evidence of that box of ammunition. Are you able to see that, Mr. Kern?
Yes, sir.
Can you explain to the jurors what part of the box that you examined for potential fingerprints?
The outside surface of the box.
And did you do the same process that you explained earlier?
I used a couple different techniques with it. I did everything that we talked about, but I also processed it with a very small size, called nano powder. It's an extremely small size powder that is magnetically charged, and nothing came up with the nano powder. I used a different formulation of the Rhodeman. I used one that was based in water, not alcohol, and I did that because I didn't want it to soak into the fibers. I wanted it to soak into the glue, not the fibers of the paper of the box. And again, nothing. I saw prints with the ultraviolet imaging, but nothing that I could ever recover, nothing suitable for identification.
So this is an example where you see a partial print, but it's not good enough to identify to anybody.
Can't do anything with it.
The gun, it looks like the box says 50. Were you able to see if any of the rounds were missing?
There were 45 rounds in the box. The container inside the box is fitted for 50 rounds. 5 of them were gone.
Did you examine the plastic at all for any potential latent prints?
Yes, I did.
And were you able to find any?
No, I saw some detail, but again, it was nothing suitable for identification.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Mr. Kern, I've handed you what has been marked as State's Exhibit number 70. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Is this a DNA report that was completed by Brenda Crosby at the Division of Criminal Investigations Laboratory?
Yes, it is.
And this is pertaining to she looked at some items for potential DNA evidence.
That is correct.
The state would offer into evidence at this time State's Exhibit number 70.
Any objection?
No objection.
All right, Exhibit 70 will be admitted.
Mr. Kern, in front of you is the DNA report. Was Ms. Crosby able to find any DNA off those swabs done of the revolver?
No, sir.
Did Ms. Crosby also look at would have been a swab of either tissue or biological from the top of the step?
Item 14 is listed as that type of material, yes, sir.
Yes. And was she able to come up with a DNA profile from that tissue or biological evidence from the top of the step?
Yes, she did.
And did that match somebody's known DNA profile?
Yes, it was consistent with the DNA profile of Samantha Teeter.
And then on item 15 did she also look at a swab of tissue or blood or hair from the wall above the apartment door?
That is correct.
And was that consistent with a known DNA profile of somebody?
Yes, it wasn't the complete profile. She wasn't able to get the complete profile, but of the profile that she was able to develop, that was also consistent with Samantha Teeter.
May I approach again, Your Honor?
Yes.
I don't have any other questions, thank you.
Cross-examination.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Kern.
Good morning, Counselor.
When you talked about whether or not a fingerprint is suitable for identification, you explained that you need a certain amount of the print itself and then details about the print. Is that right?
That is correct. It's a qualitative, quantitative, how much and how good. That's the decision point. You have to have enough to make a decision, and it's got to be good enough to rely on.
It sounds like then, with regard to fingerprints, you either have enough and you can, and you do have a print suitable for identification, or you don't have enough, in which case it's not suitable, correct?
That is correct.
There's no gray area where you might say it's partial, and so I'm 70% confident in this.
We don't offer those types of opinions. Historically, fingerprints have always been, you can either identify it to an individual. There are times that you can exclude an individual, or it's not suitable and it can be anybody, because we don't want to leave it as misleading that it could have been this person, but we're really not sure. And that's not something that we're interested in leaving anybody with, is that it could have kind of sort of been.
You talked about some of your professional organization affiliations and that as the science of fingerprint analysis has evolved, how does it ensure that the individual examiners are working with the same set of standards? Does that make sense?
Yes, and that is one of the challenges of fingerprints. Part of the way that we do that is through proficiency examinations. Part of it is through various studies that are conducted to see how fingerprint examiners are interpreting evidence. Evidence that's submitted to a variety of laboratories, and examiners have to make qualitative decisions, they have to make identifications, they have to make exclusions, and we're looking at the reliability of that across laboratories. We're looking at more consistency in training fingerprint examiners, and there is variability between examiners. That does exist. There are some that are more acute. You get better over time, and then there's a point where you get worse over time. So, you know, as far as do you have an instrument? There's no instrument available to tell you whether you're right or wrong. It's the instrument of your eye. It's the instrument of your perception. And in the DCI's case, all examinations have to be verified by a second examiner. If you don't have that verification where that person looking at it doesn't concur with the identification or with the exclusion, then we have to go through a reconciliation process. I've been at the laboratory for 10 years, and we've never had that type of an issue. But yes, there is variability between examiners.
You also mentioned that in your experience in doing these analyses, you said the least I've ever identified are 7 characteristics. And I'm just not sure that I understand what you meant, if you could explain that.
You have to have a cutoff where you believe you have sufficient ridge detail. And in my experience over the last 40 years, there are areas away from deltas. I'm very careful about a delta because in a triangular portion of a fingerprint pattern, there's a number of ridges that are trying to get through a very small space. And when they were being formed in the womb and the ridges were forming at that point, ridges had to go somewhere, and they ran into a problem because they were running out of space and they all couldn't continue to develop. So ridges have to stop development, and you see a number of ridge endings. When you see those triangles, there's an abnormally large representation of ridge endings in those locations. So 7 ridge endings in one of those triangles is not something that instills you with confidence. 7 ridge endings toward the tip of the finger that are in agreement as far as their location to one another, where they are in their relative position to one another is extremely important. And 7 in that area is exceptionally reliable. So at that point, you can make an identification. And as a practical matter, my own personal standard has never been to drop below 7. And I don't know of examiners who have.
Thank you. I appreciate that explanation. I don't have any other questions for this witness.
Redirect.
No, Your Honor.
Okay, may this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, thank you.
You can step down. You're free to go. Thank you, sir. The state may call its next witness.
Thank you. The state would call Victor Murillo to the stand.
Raise your right hand for me. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be giving the court will be the truth?
I do.
Thank you. You can have a seat. Hammerand.
Thank you. Please introduce yourself to the jury.
Yes, my name is Victor Michael Murillo. Last name is spelled Murillo.
Mr. Murillo, where do you work?
I'm employed as a criminalist with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations State Crime Laboratory in Ankeny, Iowa.
How long have you worked there?
I've been with the laboratory since July of 1982.
What section do you currently work in?
Well, currently I'm assigned to the firearms and tool mark section of our laboratory. I've also done quite a few other things in the laboratory, and most recently also done some crime scene investigation as well.
Can you briefly go through your education and training concerning being a firearm and being in the firearms section?
So originally, educational background anyways, I have an Associate of Arts degree in criminalistics from the Des Moines Area Community College, where I took several forensic classes that were kind of related to the different sections of the laboratory that I currently work in. I also have a bachelor's degree from Drake University in Des Moines. I took several science classes, and most of us in the laboratory are science background, so a lot of biology and chemistry classes. Once I was employed at the laboratory, there's quite a bit of training that we go through depending on the section that you're working in. Within the firearms section, it's about a 2-year training program that I went through when I began doing firearms cases. So a lot of my training has come in working with other criminalists in the laboratory who were there before me, so learning from them, learning from outside agencies such as the FBI. I've been to the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia about 6 or 7 different times, taking forensic classes that were related to what I was doing in the lab. A lot of classes from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They do a lot of forensic training in firearms as well. But most of the training came in-house, working with other criminalists, working with, well, in the firearms section, once I was assigned to the firearms section of the lab, a lot of my training came in looking at a lot of different types of firearms, looking at a lot of fired components. So looking at fired bullets, fired cartridge cases, ammunition, a lot of different guns, knowing how those guns function, knowing how the safeties work, make sure that they are working correctly, and then test firing those guns and doing a lot of microscopic examination of those fired components.
In this case, were you asked to look at the firearm?
Yes.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Mr. Murillo, I want to hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 5, which is a case, a gun case, and inside is State's Exhibit number 4. Looking at State's Exhibit number 4, Mr. Murillo, is this the revolver you examined in this case?
Yes, it is.
Can you explain to the jury, when you first examined it, what was the purpose, what were you trying to determine?
Well, initially when I looked at this particular firearm, pulled it out of the container or out of a box, and so there's quite a bit of information that I take off of this firearm, the make, model, serial number, what caliber that particular firearm is. So there's a worksheet that I fill out where a lot of information is generated about that gun. Once I do that, I go through the gun, as I mentioned earlier, make sure everything looks like it's functioning correctly, make sure the safeties are working if there are any, make sure the gun looks like it's going to shoot safely, and then eventually the gun is test fired.
So when you test fire the gun, if it's working properly, how do you test fire the gun and why do you do that?
So yeah, once the gun is checked and made sure that it's safe, we're going to test fire it. We would test fire this gun into a water recovery tank that we have in my lab. It's just a large stainless steel tank. It's about 3 feet by 4 feet, about maybe 8 feet long or so, 8 to 10 feet long, and filled with tap water. There's a small tube on one end of that tank. I'll stick the barrel end of the gun down inside of that tube and then fire 3 shots from the revolver. I can remove the fired cartridge cases, the test-fired cartridge cases that I just test-fired in this revolver, and I will mark all of those cartridge cases. The bullets that have gone down into the tube and into the water can be easily recovered. We use water to capture those bullets because water doesn't leave any markings. It's not going to scratch the bullet. So what we're going to see on the outside of the bullet is markings that come from the inside of the barrel. And that's exactly what we want to see. So I can recover those fired bullets. They can be marked appropriately to show that they are test fires. And then eventually I will look at those test fired bullets, the test fired cartridge cases, compare them to one another, and then use those test fires to compare to the unknown bullets and cartridge cases that have been recovered from a crime scene, a house, a wall, a car, or a victim. And I do that microscopically, looking for some unique markings.
First, State's Exhibit 4, can you tell the jury what type of gun is this?
Well, this is a Ruger, basically we call it a Black Hawk, but it's a new model Super Black Hawk revolver. It is a 6-shot revolver, so we can fire 6 shots from this particular gun before we have to reload it if we wanted to. So there are 6 chambers in the cylinder, which is in the middle of the frame. It is a single action revolver. By single action, it means that when I pull the trigger on this gun, it performs one action. It just releases the hammer, which means the shooter, in this case, has to cock the hammer first and then pull the trigger. So it's kind of like an old, if you watch any old cowboy movies, for instance, you have to cock that hammer first and then pull the trigger. If I were to load the gun now and just pull the trigger, nothing would happen. So I have to physically cock the hammer. When I do that, it rotates the cylinder to a new chamber that hopefully has a live round on it, and then I can pull the trigger. That drops the hammer and fires the cartridge that's in that chamber that's in line with the barrel. So it works a little differently than some other revolvers that have a double action mode where you can simply pull the trigger. It's kind of a long, heavy trigger pull, and it cocks the hammer and releases the hammer when you pull that trigger. In this case, you have to physically cock the hammer. When we pull the trigger, it only releases that hammer, and so it's a little lighter trigger pull, but it requires 2 actions by the shooter.
And Mr. Murillo, were you asked to bring some dummy rounds with you?
I did.
What is a dummy round?
Well, a dummy round is something that we use in the laboratory quite a bit to basically check the functionality of a firearm. So it looks like a real live round of ammunition, but there's no primer, there's no powder in that cartridge. So we can load it into a magazine and check the functionality of the gun, make sure it's working correctly. And so we use them quite a bit in the lab to make sure those guns are functioning properly.
And would using some dummy rounds be helpful in explaining to the jury how this .44 revolver operates or functions?
Yes, it could.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would ask that Mr. Murillo be able to remove the cable lock and use a couple of those dummy rounds to show how this revolver would be loaded and how it functions.
Right. Any objection, defense?
No, Your Honor.
All right, that's fine.
May I approach? I have the key.
Very well.
And while he's removing the cable lock, Your Honor, it might be easier for the jurors to see if Mr. Murillo is allowed to come down, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Mr. Murillo, if you want to
Step
stand
down.
down here, it might be
Okay.
easier. Just keep your voice up so the reporter is able to hear you, please.
Sure. So I have in my pocket a couple of .44 Magnum dummy cartridges. As I mentioned before, at the base of those cartridges is usually going to be a primer, kind of a shiny piece of metal. You can see in the bottom of those dummy cartridges, there's kind of a hole there, so there's no primer. You know, there's no powder in it. I'm not going to have any loud noises today if I pull the trigger on one of these. Again, just to check the functionality of that firearm. So basically what I'm going to do is try to show you a little bit about how the gun functions, how it's loaded, how it works. Again, this is a double action revolver. The way the gun works again is mentioned earlier, if I just pull the trigger on this firearm, it will not fire. You have to physically cock the hammer, pull this hammer to the rear, and you can watch that cylinder rotate as I do that. It's going to rotate in a clockwise fashion to the next chamber. So the chamber that would have been in about that 11 o'clock position, I cocked the hammer, it rotated to the 12 o'clock position relative to the shooter. And now the hammer is lined up with that chamber that's in that 12 o'clock position. But once I cock the hammer, I can pull the trigger. When I do that, that releases the hammer, which will fire that cartridge that's in line with the barrel. So in order to load this particular firearm, usually the way that we're going to load it is to open up what we call a loading gate on the right-hand side of the frame of that revolver. Once we've opened up that loading gate, it exposes the back end of the chambers on the back side of that cylinder. Once we've exposed the chamber, we can take one of the cartridges, a live round, this is just a dummy round, and we're going to load that cartridge into the back end of the cylinder, and then we can rotate the cylinder to the next chamber. The next one that's empty, we can load another cartridge, and we continue to do that until we've loaded up all 6 cartridges in the 6 chambers that are in that cylinder. Once everything is loaded, all the cartridges are loaded correctly, we can close up that loading gate, and now we can go ahead and fire that revolver. Just as I mentioned before, cock the hammer, pull the trigger, and that fires the round that would have been at that 11 o'clock position. So it's going to continue to rotate in that clockwise fashion until we get to the cartridges that are loaded. In this case, I can kind of see on the left-hand side here where those cartridges are on the back of the cylinder. So if I wanted to, I could pull the hammer back just a little bit, rotate those cartridges. I know that that cartridge now is in the 11 o'clock position and also in the 8 o'clock position. So now it's ready to be fired if I wanted just to fire those 2 cartridges that I loaded. So at this point, when I cock the hammer, the one that's in that 11 o'clock position is going to rotate to 12, and we can fire it. Rotate the next one, and fire it. Once we've loaded and fired all of the cartridges that are in that cylinder, we have to remove the fired cartridge cases. When we fire the gun, hammer's going to drop. That hammer is going to hit a firing pin that's on the inside of the frame. The firing pin is going to go forward and it's going to hit the primer. That's where that hole was on the back side of that cartridge. And that primer is going to cause a little spark on the inside of that cartridge. That spark is going to ignite or cause the powder to burn on the inside of that cartridge. Once that powder burns, it creates a lot of pressure. That pressure is going to push the bullet that we had on the front end of that cartridge down the barrel and towards the target that we're shooting at. That pressure is also going to be what we feel, the recoil that we're going to feel when we fire the gun. So every time you fire it, pull the trigger, the hammer drops, bullet goes down the barrel, and the gun is going to kick. That's all of that pressure that builds up inside of that chamber. It's going to push that cartridge case to the rear, the back side of the chamber, and it's going to kick, or we're going to feel that recoil from the firearm. So once we've done that, we've loaded all the cartridges and fired all of those cartridges, we now need to remove the fired cartridge case. The cartridge case is the cup that's used to hold the powder and the bullet, which would be the brass part of that dummy round that we were looking at earlier. So to remove the fired cartridge cases, all we do is open up that loading gate again. We can expose the fired cartridge case. On the bottom of the barrel, there's a small handle there with a little rod that can be used to eject those fired cartridge cases out so that we can grab them. I'm pulling out a dummy round, but it would just be the fired cartridge case, the brass part that we can see on the back side of this cartridge, right? Once we've done that, we can rotate to the next fired cartridge case, line it up, push the little rod on the underside, push that cartridge case out, and now we have as many fired cartridge cases as we've fired in that particular revolver. We're going to dump all those cartridge cases out, and then we can reload the cylinder if we wanted to. We can reload each of those chambers with a new live round, close up the gate if we wanted to, and then continue to fire after that.
Thank you, Mr. Murillo. If you may take a seat. I have a few questions before you put the cable lock back on, though, please. Mr. Murillo, you were explaining, just so it's clear, this is a single action,
Correct. Single action revolver.
requires 2 actions, though.
Correct.
And the first action, before you can fire the gun, you have to do what?
Again, you have to pull that hammer to the rear to cock the gun, basically. That's the first action,
And then the second action?
is to pull the trigger. Once you pull the trigger to the rear, that releases the hammer, which will fire the gun.
So if a gun is found and it's already cocked, the only thing that needs necessary to fire it would just be pull the trigger.
Correct, yes.
Can you, if the gun is cocked, can you release the hammer without firing the gun?
Yes, once the hammer is cocked, if we decide we want to cock it, maybe decide we're not going to shoot at that time, we could, sometimes what we call is thumbing down the hammer. We could grab hold of the back end of the hammer, pull the trigger, and then allow that hammer to safely lower onto the back end of that frame. You have to be very careful when you do that. If you slip and let go of that hammer as you're pulling that trigger, it will fire. Once we've cocked the hammer and we pulled the trigger to release it, we can let go of the trigger and then allow that hammer to fall, and it will not fire a live round. But if we're pulling the trigger, it's going to fire.
Concerning, you're familiar with .44 revolvers, I assume?
Yes.
And were there older .44 revolvers that had a tendency, did you always load all the chambers?
The original Blackhawk revolver, just like this one, but the older style of Blackhawk, did not have an internal safety in it. This one, I mentioned earlier, if I cock the hammer and then pull the trigger, or allow that hammer to go forward and then let go of the trigger, once that hammer is in that resting position, it will not fire a cartridge. On the old original Blackhawk, there was no internal, it's called a transfer bar safety in it. So if I were to do that, if I were to load this cylinder completely full of live ammo, and I were to cock this hammer and decide, I'm not going to shoot at this time, let's shoot at a later time. So I'm going to thumb the hammer down, and I'm going to let that hammer rest. The older style revolvers did not have a transfer bar safety in them. So when this hammer was at that resting position, it's resting on the firing pin, it's pushing the firing pin forward, and that firing pin is resting against a primer, a live primer in that cartridge, which is in the chamber in that 12 o'clock position. So it's resting on a live round. So if we were to drop this gun, for instance, or hit the back end of the hammer, if we were to drop it on the ground and it hit the back end of the hammer, it would drive the hammer forward, push the firing pin forward, the firing pin would go into the primer, and that cartridge would go off. It would fire if we were to drop it with that live round in the chamber and the hammer in that full forward resting position. With the newer gun, like this one, that will not happen. When that hammer is in that resting position, there is a transfer bar safety in there that drops out of the way, and it does not allow the hammer to touch the firing pin. So it's safe to load the entire cylinder with cartridges, and if we wanted to lower that hammer, it would not rest on a live round. It would rest against the frame, and it would not fire if we dropped it. But the old original ones, they would fire, and it was a problem.
So State's Exhibit 4, because of the internal safety feature, if it's dropped, it's not going to go off accidentally.
Correct, it will not go off.
But because of the older models was there a tendency to keep a chamber empty?
Well, if you had one of those old revolvers, or you're familiar with the old single action type revolvers and the problems that they had, then that was the way that it was loaded, is that you would load only 5 of the chambers and leave the 6th one empty. And then when you rotated that cylinder, you would always leave the hammer resting on an empty chamber. So if you did drop it, you wouldn't have an accidental discharge. So again, that comes from the old world knowledge about the old guns and the way that they worked. That will not happen with this firearm, but if you're knowledgeable about the way the old guns work, then that could be something that could be in the back of your mind, is that we should leave that 12 o'clock chamber empty because it could go off. And with some revolvers, it will if you have an older style, but this one, it will not.
State's Exhibit 4 is safe that way.
It is safe. It's the new model, that's why they call it the new model, that does have the internal transfer bar safety on it.
Is there an external safety on State's Exhibit 4?
There is not. The only safety really is to cock the hammer. The only way this gun is going to fire is by cocking the hammer and pulling the trigger. There is no external safety. There's nothing that a lever that I can flip on or off to keep the gun from firing. The gun is not going to fire until we physically cock that hammer to the rear and pull the trigger.
If you would put the cable lock back on, please.
Sure.
Mr. Murillo, I want to show you State's Exhibit number 12. This was yesterday. Investigator McChesney, they did a video of State's Exhibit 4, the revolver that was found, and the location of the different cartridge cases in the revolver. If I may play that at this time.
Yes, you may.
Mr. Murillo, were you able to, I know it wasn't the best quality there, were you able to see okay?
Yes, yes.
Could you see if there were some fired rounds and unfired rounds?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if they were familiar with it, but yeah, when you rotated that cylinder, the first 3 cartridges that we could see in the first 3 chambers had a little indentation in the primer. In the middle of that silver part of the back of the cartridges, you could see an indentation or a little crater that was made by the firing pin. So there were 3 fired cartridge cases. Those were the first 3 that you showed during the video. And as we rotated it clockwise to the right, you could see the next 2 show up as live rounds of ammunition, and then you could see that empty chamber. So very similar to what we were just talking about.
So the empty chamber at the beginning would have had, and the gun was fired in this case, the empty chamber would have been at the 12 o'clock position. Because we have 3 fired rounds and then 2 unfired rounds and then an empty chamber.
Yeah, assuming the gun was loaded and kept in that condition, that empty chamber would have been in that 12 o'clock position to start with. And then we saw the fired cartridge cases to the left of that. So in that 11 o'clock position, 9 o'clock position, 7 o'clock position, those were fired cartridge cases. So if we were to cock the gun with that empty in the 12 o'clock position, remember it's going to rotate clockwise. So the first one that we fired would be that first cartridge cases that was in that 11 o'clock position. Fire it again, and that was going to rotate to the right. So the next 3 that were to the left, which were fired cartridge cases, would have been the first 3 that we fired, 1, 2, and 3. And if we didn't fire any more, that hammer should be resting on that last fired cartridge case. If we played with that cylinder or cocked it again, we would cock it so that it would maybe resting on the next chamber, which would be a live round. it still would be safe, it wouldn't be a problem, but, so I don't know originally how it was found, but that's why those cartridges were in those positions.
And in this case, State's Exhibit 4, the .44 revolver, did it function properly?
Yes, it did.
And did you test fire some rounds?
Yes.
And when you test fired rounds, did you use any ammunition that was familiar with this case?
Yes, I did.
What did you use?
There was, again, those 2 live rounds that you saw in the cylinder, those were submitted. The fired cartridge cases were submitted. And then there was a box of ammunition that was also submitted that had 25 rounds of, or excuse me, 45 rounds of ammunition in a 50-round box. I like to use the same ammunition when I do my test fires as what was used in the original case. It produces the best marks on the bullet, the best marks on the cartridge case, similar to what was used in the actual shooting. And so that's going to be best for me. So what I did is took 3 rounds from that box of ammunition, and that's what I used to test fire the revolver.
And you explained to us after you test fire the, you collect the cartridge case and you collect the bullets.
Correct.
And then how do you compare them to cartridges or cases that are collected from the crime scene? How do you make that comparison at the lab?
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier there's a microscopic examination that's done for each of those. So the first 3 things that I looked at would be the test-fired cartridge cases that I produced from the revolver. So I'm going to look at those microscopically and look for any unique pattern of markings that might be on the primer, on the back side of that cartridge. Those markings come from, remember that cartridge case, it slams against the back side of the chamber when it's fired and produces that recoil. Any manufacturing marks that are on the back side of the chamber are going to be impressed onto the flat side of that primer when it's fired. So that's my job, is to look at those markings, see if they are the same, see if there's a duplication of those markings on the test-fired cartridge cases. So I'll always look at those first, and I'm going to take one of the test-fired cartridge cases and compare that to the unknowns, the 3 fired cartridge cases that came in with the revolver. And that's done, again, microscopically, looking for that unique pattern of markings.
And when you're looking at these microscopically, are you able to look at it through the microscope and see both the test-fired cartridge case and the one from the crime scene and look at them at the same time?
Yeah, what I'm using is a comparison microscope, so it's a little different than most microscopes you might see in a high school science room, for instance. So there are 2 stages on my microscope. So on one stage, I'm going to place the test-fired cartridge case. On the other stage, the unknown cartridge case that came in with the revolver that supposedly came out of the cylinder of this gun. So when I look through the viewfinder, I'll look through the optics, I can see both of those cartridge cases side by side. So I can rotate them, I can superimpose the 2 if I wanted to, put one on top of the other as I'm looking at them. But I'm going to rotate those cartridge cases and see if I can align those markings with that comparison microscope.
And when you're doing this, are you able to anyway record what you see so you can show a jury later?
Yes, once we come up with the results in a particular case, then I try to document everything in notes, and then I try to take photographs of some of the markings that I see.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Mr. Murillo, I'm going to hand you 2 exhibits. One is already in evidence, State's Exhibit 6, and then I'll hand you State's Exhibit 68 as well. Thanks, Your Honor. Starting with State's Exhibit 6, are these the 3 spent cartridge cases that were collected at the crime scene?
Yes, I believe they are.
And did you compare those to the test-fired ones from State's Exhibit 4, the .44 revolver?
Yes.
Then I handed you State's Exhibit number 68. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, 68 is a copy of a couple of the photographs that I mentioned I had taken during my examination of the items.
The state would offer into evidence State's Exhibit number 68.
No objection.
Exhibit 68 is admitted.
Mr. Murillo, State's Exhibit 68 has two photos, one on top and bottom. Which one do you prefer to start with?
Yeah, let's start with the bottom one. I think it might be a little easier to explain.
We'll put that, if we may publish that, Your Honor.
Yes.
We have that on the TV screen. Mr. Murillo, can you explain to the jurors what we're looking at?
Yeah, so this is a photograph, again, that was taken with that comparison microscope. So you can see how it can see two different things at the same time, or at least it looks like two different things. There is a black line that's running vertically through that photograph, right down the middle. That's my separation line, a line of demarcation, as we call it. So on the left side of that black line that's running through the middle is one of the test-fired cartridge cases that I produced from the revolver. If you look at the bottom, I've kind of labeled it, that's my case number. That's 16-32433, and on the left side is my item 7, which is the firearm in this case. So don't get that confused with the state item. When it came into my laboratory, we made that item 7, the gun. So the test-fired cartridge cases that I produced from item 7, the revolver, that's one of them that you're seeing on the left-hand side. So it's labeled as 7 test-fire versus 17-1. 17-1 is one of the fired cartridge cases that was submitted in this case, one of the 3 that I have in this little Ziploc bag, which is State's Exhibit number 6. So the two things that we're looking at here are the bases of those 2 cartridge cases. We can see the head stamp information around the outside of them. On the left, you can see the 44 REM, R-E-M, and then it's supposed to be Magnum or MAG, M-A-G. You can't see all of it there. And then you can see the lettering on the right-hand side too. In the middle of both of those cartridge cases is the primer. That's where the markings are going to be that I'm interested in. So that silver, that shiny silver area in the middle of the head of those 2 cartridge cases is the primer. In the middle of the primer is a round indentation. It's a crater. That was produced when the firing pin hit the middle of that primer to cause that spark inside of that cartridge. So there's some interesting marks that I want to look at down inside of that crater from the end of the firing pin and also on the flat side of that primer. It's been flattened out because of the pressure and being pushed against the breech face. On the flat side of the primer, you can see some parallel markings going across that primer. Those are what we call breech face marks. Those come from that pressure that was built up in that cartridge slamming it against the backside of the chamber. And so what I'm trying to do is compare those markings, those scratches and or impressions across the face of that primer and see if they are the same between the two. So at least in this photograph, I'm kind of zoomed out on those 2 cartridge cases to kind of give you an idea of where some of those marks are on those 2 cartridge cases.
And we can look at the top half of State's Exhibit 68. Would you explain the purpose of this photograph?
So again, we talked earlier about breech face, and if you look at the bottom, we still have item 7 on the left, 17-1 on the right. BFC stands for breech face. So those are those markings I told you that came from the backside of the chamber. So now what I've done is I've taken some of those striated markings, those impressions, those lines that you can see on both cartridge cases on the left side of both of those primers, and I put the 2 of them closer together. And now we can kind of see how those markings flow from one side of the photograph to the other, and how that same pattern shows up on both cartridge cases. So that's the information that I'm looking for, that unique pattern that was produced only by this particular revolver.
And that was my next question, Mr. Murillo, is does each gun, revolver or not, is it unique, we're talking handguns, in leaving a pattern? Can you identify each gun specifically?
Yes, each of those markings, that set of markings on the breech face are going to be unique to each particular firearm. So it's going to be kind of like its own unique signature or its own fingerprint, if you will, that's going to be left on every fired cartridge case. So it is unique to this specific firearm.
So what was the results of making the comparison of State's Exhibit 6, the 3 fired cartridge cases that were collected at the crime scene, and comparing it to the 3 test-fired rounds with the .44 revolver.
Yeah, so I looked at all 3 of these fired cartridge cases and did this same type of examination, found these same type of markings, and all 3 cartridge cases were identified as having been fired in the Ruger revolver.
Did you also look at some bullet fragments that were recovered, or partial bullets?
Yes,
And did you do the same process of looking at the test-fired bullets compared to the bullets or bullet fragments at the scene?
yes,
And did you take any photographs of those?
yes.
May I approach?
Yes.
Mr. Murillo, I've handed you what has been marked as State's Exhibit 69. Is this a couple of the photographs you would have taken of the bullet comparison?
Yes.
The state would offer into evidence State's Exhibit number 69.
No objection.
Exhibit 69 is admitted.
Mr. Murillo, does State's Exhibit number 69 have 2 photographs, the top and bottom as well?
Yes.
Do you have a preference on which one we start with?
Top one, if we can, please.
Would you explain the purpose of this photograph?
Again, the same process as we used earlier. We're looking at 2 different bullets here. You can see the same line that separates the 2 images. On the left-hand side is one of the test-fired bullets from my item 7, or the Ruger revolver. On the right-hand side is one of the fired bullet fragments, the copper jacket from one of those fired bullets. And you can see that that copper jacket has a little bit of damage to the right-hand side of it. Some of the petals are starting to open up or move around a little bit. But I'm interested in the widths of those bullet fragments. If we look from top to bottom, we can see the width of the bullet is pretty much the same. And then I'm also interested in the rifling markings that are present on the outside of these 2 bullets, the test fire and the unknown. On the inside of the barrel are going to be some spiral grooves that are cut into that barrel that will engage with the outside of the bullet as it's fired. It causes that bullet to spin with the rifling, and it leaves these grooves that we're seeing on the outside surface of the bullet. There's a lot of friction that occurs between the outside of the bullet and the inside of the barrel as well. And there are scratches that are being produced on the outside of the bullet from that barrel. So first of all, I want to make sure that the rifling dimensions, the widths of those grooves are the same between the 2, and you can see that they are very similar. And now I want to look down inside of those 2 grooves that you see in the middle of those 2 bullets, looking for tiny little scratches or another unique set of markings, a pattern of unique markings that is, again, unique to this particular revolver. Are they the same between the test fire and the unknown?
And on the right-hand side would be one of the bullet fragments, copper jacket, that was recovered from the scene.
Yes,
They're not in evidence yet, it'll be through the next witness, but that's what you were looking at.
correct.
And did you look at specifically, I believe it was 4 different copper jackets?
There were 3 copper-jacketed bullets, a small copper fragment, and a lead fragment, so there are several items that I looked at.
So on the right-hand side, would be one of the copper jacket bullets that was collected from the scene compared to the left, the test-fired bullet.
Correct.
And then we have the second part of Exhibit 69, the next photograph. What does this photograph show?
So this is the same set of 2 bullets, test fire on the left, the unknown on the right. Now you can see we kind of zoomed in on that one groove, that width of that groove that was in the middle of the bullet. And now we can see the striations that I was talking about, the fine little lines. And you can see how they line up between the 2 on the test fire on the left, the unknown on the right. This same set of unique little scratches is going to show up in several of those grooves all the way around the circumference of the bullet. So it's more than just what we're seeing here is what I'm doing my comparison with. These markings are going to show up all the way around the bullet. So this just kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of one of those areas that I used to make my comparison.
And what was the results of your comparison to the test-fired bullets to the bullets that were, or fragments that were recovered from the crime scene?
So there were 3 bullet fragments that came from the scene. There were my items 9, 10, and 11 that all came from the scene. All 3 of those bullet fragments were identified as having been fired from this Ruger revolver.
And when you say this Ruger revolver, State's Exhibit 4,
State's Exhibit number 5, yes.
I'm sorry, 4, I think, inside.
Okay, 5 is the case, I'm sorry, yes, 4 is the revolver.
Thank you, Mr. Murillo. I don't have any other questions.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, Mr. Murillo.
Morning.
When you were talking about the empty cylinder and the old style guns versus the new style guns, carrying a revolver with an empty cylinder immediately above the hammer was considered a safety measure.
Yes,
And apparently, because of problems, the firearm manufacturer created an internal mechanism so that would not be necessary.
correct.
You talked about the 2 actions that a shooter must take to fire this gun. Cock the hammer and pull the trigger, correct?
Yes,
And you also talked about what you referred to as thumbing down the hammer. So if
Yes.
If you
Sorry.
had a cocked hammer and you wanted it to be down, you would hold the hammer with a thumb, let's say, squeeze the trigger and ride the hammer forward
correct.
very carefully and very gingerly.
Pointing it in a safe direction, yes. It's not a safe thing to do, but it's the only way to lower that hammer into that resting position, yes.
Will this firearm fire if you hold the trigger down? Let's say you fire a shot and hold the trigger down and just pull the hammer back and let it go.
As long as you're pulling that trigger to the rear, yes, you can cock the hammer as many times as you want. The cylinder is going to rotate and it's going to fire. That hammer is going to be released because you've already pulled the trigger to the rear, so yes, it will fire.
So I'm kind of a fan of history. And back in the Old West days, when they had single-action revolvers, gunfighters, for lack of a better term, would take a piece of cord or string and tie the hammer to the rear, wouldn't they? So they could just fan the hammer
You could, yes,
and shoot it faster.
yes.
Okay. I guess that was an extreme example. In our particular case, merely holding the hammer and trying to cock the gun while the hammer is pulled and letting go of the hammer will fire the weapon.
As long as your finger is on the trigger, when we're pulling the trigger to the rear, if we hold that trigger to the rear, we can cock the hammer, let it go, and it will fire, cock it again, let it go. So maybe in the Old West, you've talked about pulling that trigger and just fanning your hand across the top of the revolver, cocking the hammer and allowing it to go forward. It will continue to fire if you do that.
So if a person holds the trigger in a pulled position, the hammer will not lock to the rear.
Correct.
Okay. This particular type of firearm, a 44 caliber firearm, has a lot of recoil, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And you talked about that being the result of the pressure in the cartridge. When the cartridge is fired, the gun will recoil or kick.
Yes.
And because of that, this particular type of gun, this caliber, is very hard to control, isn't it?
It is, yes.
All right. That's all I have, Your Honor. Thank you, sir.
Redirect.
No other questions, thank you.
All right. May this witness be excused.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
You can step down. You're free to go. Thank you, sir. State may call its next witness.
The state would call Tammy Orr to the stand.
you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be giving the court will be the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. You can have a seat.
Please introduce yourself to the jury.
My name is Tammy Orr. I'm with Mason City Police Department.
For the record, would you spell your first and last name?
Tammy, T-A-M-M-Y. Last name Orr, O-R-R.
Ms. Orr, the microphone moves, so you may want to, wherever it works best for you. Where do you work?
Mason City Police Department,
Guess you told us that if I'd be paying attention. How long have you worked there?
22 years.
What department do you work in?
I'm an identification technician. I'm assigned to the Criminal Investigations Division.
As an identification technician, are you a law enforcement officer?
No, I'm a civilian.
And specifically, what type of work do you do as an identification technician?
I'm responsible for the department's evidence room, and I can also respond to crime scenes. I check evidence in and out for the county attorney, out to the state lab, those types of things.
Did you have to have some type of specialized training?
I have a 2-year degree in communications from Kirkwood Community College, and then I continued on with some specific crime scene instruction through the Iowa IAI, which is the International Association for Identification, and it would be the Iowa chapter. And they have basic crime scene school, advanced crime scene school, and then yearly trainings as well.
Ms. Orr, how does it work at the Mason City Police Department concerning the evidence room? Can you briefly explain how evidence is checked in or checked out?
Sure. Officers or investigators, they all are able to collect and log in their own evidence. They package it, they secure it in temporary bins or baskets. Then it's my job to take those items and decide, is this something that needs to be analyzed further with the state, or are we just going to hold on to it? The evidence room at the police department is a secure area. We only have 3 personnel that have keys or access to that area, and that would be where we would permanently store those items.
So if a police officer wanted to get a piece of evidence, could he or she just walk into the evidence room?
Absolutely not.
And when you log evidence into the evidence room, is it manually done? Is it through computer? How is it stored?
It's through computer and by barcode number.
Ms. Orr, I want to turn your attention to this case. Did you get involved at some point at the crime scene?
Yes,
Do you know approximately when you would have went to the crime scene?
I think around 9 a.m.
And as an evidence technician, what was your role at the crime scene?
That day I acted primarily as a scribe,
It may sound obvious, but for the record, what does that mean?
recording the items that we were seizing as evidence.
Were you at the Mr. Whaley's apartment and also the hallway, the entryway there?
Yes,
Were there other investigators that were assisting you?
yes.
And do you remember who else was helping?
I believe Investigator McChesney, Onder, Hugie, and then we had 2 officers that were assigned to the technical drawing assignment. That would have been Officer Ott and Officer Hewitt.
When evidence was found or located, how did it get to you then?
The officer or investigator that was pointing it out or seizing it would bring it to me, and then I would record it and package it
When you say record it, what does that mean?
on a handwritten, it's a worksheet type thing. It's called an evidence collection sheet.
So you would jot down, would you mark that item so you know what that item was then?
Yes, like the first item that came would be item 1, and then on the bag or the package would have the corresponding number.
Then after the evidence was collected, what did you do with it?
At the end, we load it in a vehicle and take it back to the police department.
At some point, did some evidence get sent to the DCI laboratory for testing?
Yes.
When you were there with the collection of evidence, were photographs taken as well?
Yes.
And why maybe not you specifically, but why do law enforcement officers take photographs at a crime scene?
For documentation purposes, for reference, and for situations like this, to be able to take someone back to that scene.
We've seen some photographs so far, Ms. Orr, but I'm going to hand you some additional ones. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Ms. Orr, I've handed you some photographs, State's Exhibits 34, 35, 36, 39, and 40. Are these some of the photographs that would have been taken inside Mr. Whaley's? Do they fairly and accurately depict what you observed that day?
Yes.
The state would offer into evidence State's Exhibits 34, 35, 36, 39, and 40.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Then Exhibits 34, 35, 36, 39, and 40 are admitted.
Permission to publish, Your Honor?
You may.
We'll start with State's Exhibit 34. Ms. Orr, what are we looking at in this photograph?
34 would be the view from the doorway looking into the apartment.
So this is the entryway to Mr. Whaley's apartment.
Correct.
The door is open in this photograph.
Yes.
This-
From the landing area, the outside of the apartment.
Is this the door to Mr. Whaley's apartment?
Correct.
We're looking at from the outside.
Yes.
And did you see any damage to the door?
Yes.
What did you see?
A hole.
I want to show you State's Exhibit 30. You see that?
Yes.
What does this photograph show?
This would be the door trim.
We're looking at the
to
bottom.
Yes, the bottom across the floor to Mr. Whaley's apartment door.
The door is open to Mr. Whaley's apartment. This would show the bottom of the door frame.
Correct.
State's Exhibit 31. What does this show?
This would be a view of the apartment door from the inside of the apartment, and it's open.
The door is open in this photograph.
Correct.
And then off to the right-hand side of State's Exhibit 31 do you see that in the photograph?
Yes.
What's there?
This picture also documents 2 holes.
All right. May I approach again, Your Honor?
Yes.
So it's clear. I think people can see it okay. This is the inside of Mr. Whaley's apartment. This is the door open. To the right, you're mentioning 2 holes.
Yes.
Is that where the sheetrock eventually was removed?
Yes.
State's Exhibit 32. What does this photograph show?
This is of the door frame near the lock area.
And then State's Exhibit number 33. What does this show?
This would be the door after it was removed, and it was back at the police department.
So the actual door was removed
Correct.
and was kept at the Mason City Police Department?
Yes.
And prior to coming to court today, did we ask the door be brought here to the courthouse?
Yes.
Your Honor, if we may have a moment, the door is in the next room. We would like to offer in the actual door, State's Exhibit number 3.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
All right, let's do that, and I think we'll break for mid-morning at that time.
You want us to bring the door in first or after break?
How long do you think it'll take to bring the door in?
Wouldn't take too long.
15 seconds, I think.
Let's do that first.
Ms. Orr, we have what's marked as State's Exhibit number 3. Is this the actual door that was taken from Mr. Whaley's apartment?
Yes,
And is this the condition the door was when you received it?
yes,
Obviously, there's a tag on which we'll take off at break, but otherwise it's in the same condition.
yes.
The state would offer into evidence State's Exhibit number 3.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Exhibit 3 is admitted. Council, I think we'll take a mid-morning break now. Members of the jury, 15 minutes, and we'll continue on with the testimony of Ms. Orr. All rise for the jury, please. Courtroom may be seated.
Sorry, Judge, do you want me to move that or
No.
do something with it, or?
We're off the record now. Once you've addressed it, I think, unless you intend to bring it up with other witnesses' testimony, probably what we should do is agree on whether it's just set sideways and cross in front of the bench. We'll have to do something with it.
Above the lock, is that blood or just something else?
Oh, that is blood.
I would
Glove?
gloves.
I know, we just,
Yeah, we're not gonna be, we're just gonna show Ms. Orr the door, show which is inside, outside. But yeah, because obviously it goes back to the jury room, they can have gloves back there if they wanna touch it.
Sure.
But I mean, before you start moving it and laying it down.
If you have a scissors, I'll cut that tag off.
Yeah. All right, so we'll be back, ready to go in 15 minutes. You're free to step down, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Orr, I want to make sure it's clear for the record. If we're looking at State's Exhibit 3, this is the door to apartment number 2, Mr. Whaley's apartment.
Yes,
And there's a State's Exhibit number 3 in the top right-hand corner.
yes,
The side of the door that has the State's Exhibit sticker on, is that the inside of the door, inside the apartment, or the outside?
this would be the inside of the apartment.
So if we're looking at the sticker State's Exhibit 3 with the door handle on the left, we'd be inside the apartment going to the hallway.
Correct,
The opposite side's obviously in the hallway looking in.
right.
And there is some, looks like a substance by the locks. If people are handling this door, should they wear gloves?
Yes,
Is that just for safety precaution?
yes.
Thank you. Ms. Orr, did you and other law enforcement officers collect bullet fragments from the hallway as well as inside apartment number 2?
Yes,
And then eventually were they collected and taken back to the laboratory?
yes,
I'm sorry, to the police department?
correct.
May I approach?
Yes.
Ms. Orr, I've handed you what's been marked as State's Exhibit number 7. Are these the bullet fragments that are bullets that were collected from Mr. Whaley's apartment in the hallway?
Yes,
The state would offer into evidence State's Exhibit number 7.
No objection.
Exhibit 7 will be admitted.
May I approach again?
Yes.
Ms. Orr, did law enforcement officer take pictures of the hallway as well when you were processing the scene?
yes,
And I've handed you some photographs. Are these just some of the photographs that would have been taken of that area?
yes,
State would offer into evidence State's Exhibits 21 through 24 and 26.
Right. Any objection, Ms. Eimerman?
No, Your Honor.
Exhibits 21, 22, 23, 24, and 26 are admitted.
Permission to publish?
You may.
We'll start with State's Exhibit number 21. Ms. Orr, what does this show?
items on the floor in the hallway,
Is this in the landing by Mr. Whaley's door?
Yes.
Then State's Exhibit number 22. Can you tell us what that is?
22, that's a biological on a part of the floor outside.
State's Exhibit 23.
Also appears to be a biological or possibly a bone
If
on the carpet.
We're looking at the bottom left-hand corner of the picture.
At the bottom left could also be tissues.
Okay. State's Exhibit 24.
Same thing, some biologicals on the floor.
And this is outside in the hallway and this, on the
We're still
steps.
in the hallway, yes.
State's Exhibit 26. What's State's Exhibit 26?
26 is a card or a piece of paper that was found in the security door.
Going back for a second to State's Exhibit 24, we see cones here. Are the cones removed? Take a photograph of what was underneath it?
Yes, that's correct.
And what's your understanding why the cones were placed there?
The cones were placed to secure the evidence. This is a apartment building, so the stairways could have been a common area, just basically to preserve the items.
And did you also do a swab with some type of cotton Q-tip or some type of instrument to get any biologicals from the top of a step?
Yes,
And how do you do that?
with sterile swabs.
And then when you do the sterile swab, do you put them all in the same box?
No, each swab would get its own individual swab box.
Did you also do a swab of tissue or blood or hair from the wall above the apartment door?
Yes,
And were those sent to the DCI laboratory for testing?
customarily, yes, we do. Those particular ones, I'd have to look at the reports, but
Okay. I want to show you 3 additional photographs. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Ms. Orr, State's Exhibits 56, 57, and 58, are these clothing from Samantha Teeter?
yes,
The state would offer into evidence the photographs of those clothing, State's Exhibits 56, 57, and 58.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor,
Right.
thank you.
Exhibits 56, 57, and 58 are admitted.
Starting with State's Exhibit 56. Ms. Orr, can you tell us what this shows?
that is a sports bra and a glove.
Is it your understanding Ms. Teeter's clothing was eventually collected from the hospital and brought to the Mason City Police Department?
Yes,
State's Exhibit 57. Can you tell us what that is?
57, a winter coat believed to be worn by Samantha, and a key.
Did you find the key,
The key was in the pocket, yes,
the pocket of this coat?
yes.
And if you look at the key, I know we can't do a close-up, is there a number on it?
It is stamped with a number 2.
Then State's Exhibit 58. What is this?
58 is a close-up of that key, and it would be the other side of the key from the previous picture.
Same key we saw on the coat, now it's just flipped over.
Yes,
Did you try this key in the locks to State's Exhibit number 3 to Mr. Whaley's apartment door?
yes,
So if we went on the opposite side of the state sticker, and when you stuck the key in the bottom lock, did it work?
yes, it does.
Does the key work for did it work for the deadbolt as well?
Yes, it did.
So that one key opens both locks to State's Exhibit 3?
Correct.
Did you also collect Samantha Teeter's stocking hat and headband?
Yes, we did.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Ms. Orr, starting with State's Exhibit number 9, can you tell us what that is?
That is the stocking cap?
This is Samantha Teeter's cap that she was wearing.
Correct.
And State's Exhibit number 10,
Is her headband.
the state would offer into evidence State's Exhibits 9 and 10.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Exhibits 9 and 10 are admitted.
Ms. Orr, starting with State's Exhibit number 9, the stocking cap, Samantha Teeter's stocking cap, was there any holes found in the hat?
Yes.
Explain. What I mean by that is did the hole, just one hole go through the hat, or was there 2 holes?
2 holes.
So in the front of the hat, and
Yes, and through the back.
how about with the headband?
Consistent with the holes in the stocking cap.
Hole in the front and the back
Correct.
as well? Same with the door, if there's any bodily fluid on the hat or headband, if person was to touch it, they should be wearing gloves.
Yes, definitely.
May I approach?
Yes.
I don't have any other questions, thank you.
Cross-examination, Ms. Eimerman.
We have no questions, thank you.
May this witness be excused then?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. You can step down. You're free to go. Thank you, ma'am. State may call its next witness.
Your Honor. We would call Officer Noah Fries. It'll be just a little bit, Your Honor. We're moving ahead of schedule, so he's on his way.
That's a good thing to have to deal with,
Yeah.
being ahead of schedule.
Yep.
Mr. Hammerand,
Yes.
is the next witness en route to the courthouse? Is that what we believe?
I think so. Let me verify that, Your Honor. He may actually be here in the parking lot coming up, but I'll verify that.
Appreciate that.
Your Honor, I think we'll go out of order just a little bit. Noah Fries is on his way, but just have a couple questions for Officer Onder here. So this is Aaron Onder, and we can just ask him some questions, and then we'll go right into Noah Fries.
That's fine. Officer, if you'll step forward, please. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be giving in court will be the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. You can have a seat.
Would you please introduce yourself to the jury?
I'm Investigator Aaron Onder.
And would you spell your first and last?
My post-high school education includes graduation from the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy. I also have a bachelor's degree in criminal justice with a minor in psychology, and then I have a master's degree in criminal justice.
And do you have any special training?
Yes, I do have some special training. I've completed a basic crime scene course, some interview and interrogation training as well.
Now, on December 2nd of 2016, were you called to assist with the investigation in this case?
Yes.
And when you were called to assist, where did you go first?
I went to the police department first.
And what were you instructed? What was your role at that point in time?
My role was to talk to Caleb at that time.
And so, did you get any information about the case prior to being able to talk to Caleb Van Syok?
I got just a brief overview of what had happened, not a lot of detail, but I was briefed on the incident.
So then your first event in this case was just to interview Caleb?
Yes.
And so you conducted that interview?
Yes, I did.
Was there anything that you collected from him at all while you did the interview?
Yes, there was. I collected his sweatshirt. I took a swab from his chin, and I also collected his cell phone.
And is that a normal procedure when you see something like blood that you would collect that?
Yes, yes, that is.
And further investigation, you were aware that he was with Samantha Teeter at the scene while she was bleeding? Did you find out that information?
Yes, yes, I did.
Now, after the interview, did you assist in getting any search warrants?
I assisted with executing a search warrant, yes.
And was that at 116 17th Southeast here in Mason City?
Yes,
And that was known to be Larry Whaley's residence?
yes, it was.
Now, what was your role in executing the search warrant at that residence?
My main role was taking photographs and assisting with any evidence collection.
So did you take a lot of the photographs at this scene?
Yes, I took quite a few of the photographs at the scene.
And can you tell the jury kind of how the process worked as far as collecting evidence and you taking photographs?
As far as me taking photographs, I start from the outside, work my way in. So I'd take a picture of the outside of the residence, and then maybe I'd go in and then take a picture of a doorway. Sergeant Lilquist had showed me some things that appeared to be evidence, so I took pictures of those, and then I worked my way into the inside the apartment.
Now, as far as the pictures of the gun, did you take most of those pictures?
Yes,
And also there was a video. Were you present when the video of the gun was taken?
yes, I took the video with my camera. It also has a video feature on it.
Did you notice, and were you taking pictures of what you thought was important evidence in this case?
Yes,
And so did you take pictures, for example, of the door
yes, yes, I did.
and the bullet holes to the side in the sheetrock?
Yes.
Now, did you also, after you completed the search of the apartment, did you also assist in the search of the vehicle?
Yes, I did.
And again, why would you search the vehicle, and that vehicle known to be owned by Larry Whaley in this case?
We searched the vehicle. It was known to be owned by Mr. Whaley. We wanted to search it to see if there was any evidence that was related to the incident.
And what did you find in the vehicle?
Found a box of ammunition. It was tucked behind the passenger seat. There's a pocket behind the seat, and it was just kind of tucked in that pocket. And also found there was a cell phone box in there and some receipts that we found as well.
And I think we've seen pictures of all of that, but you were assisting in collecting those items?
Yes.
And what's the process that you go through when there are evidentiary items to get them back to the police department?
We'll photograph it, collect it, put it in an evidence bag, and then when we're all ready to leave the scene, we'll take the evidence with us. It might go in our vehicle or a squad car, whatever the person's driving that is in charge of taking it back to the police department, goes back to the police department, and there we can finish putting tape on it and sealing it up and getting it logged into our system.
I want to go back just for a second. Inside the residence, did you observe two large, what appeared to be large kitchen knives?
Yes, I did, on the floor.
And you took pictures of those knives?
Yes, I did.
Can you describe approximately where you saw them when you were taking the pictures?
Yes, they were, as you walked into the apartment, they would have been to my left as I'm walking in, into the door of the apartment. On the floor would be like I guess the living room area.
I just want to show you that picture. It's State's Exhibit 40 that's been offered and admitted, just to make sure we're clear on the knives that we're talking about. Are these the knives that you saw just in the entranceway to the apartment on the floor?
Yes, those are.
And I just want to, may I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm going to hold that right here. This is State's Exhibit 65. And right here is number 7, and that appears to correspond to the knives. Is that approximately where you took the pictures then of the knives?
Yes.
And so this is the corresponding number where the knives were found?
Yes.
That's all the questions I have for you. Thank you, officer.
Cross-examination.
No questions, thank you.
All right. May this witness be excused, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Eimerman?
Yes,
All
thank
right.
you.
You can step down. You're free to go, officer. Thank you.
And also with Investigator Terrence Prohaska.
Let me just back up a little bit. Just explain to me a little bit about what your duties and what your position was with the Mason City Police Department on or about December 2nd.
Sure. At that time, I was assigned to the investigating investigations unit.
So approximately what time do you get called in?
I usually go in around 10 a.m. at that time.
So this would have been about 10 a.m. Later on in the morning of December 2nd of 2016?
Yes.
And when you were briefed in this matter, what were you asked to assist with?
Investigator Prohaska had said that they needed some follow-up, continue investigations with the Days Inn. They had received information, I'm not exactly sure how, of that Mr. Whaley had spent the night there, the prior night there, and they needed me to go out there and to confirm that or just kind of investigate it, see exactly what the details of that stay was.
So he had purchased a room at the Days Inn,
Yes.
and that Days Inn was here in Mason City, Iowa?
Yes.
Now, before going to the Days Inn, was there a procedure that you did as far as getting a search warrant for that Days Inn?
No, actually, I went to the Days Inn, spoke with them there, and then I went and proceeded to get a search warrant.
And so you were involved in getting a search warrant before the search of the before the search of the Days Inn room?
Yes, I authored the search warrant.
Now, as far as the information for the search warrant, were you able to find out what room you were going to search?
Yes.
And was that room 128?
Yes, it was.
Now, before you search a room, what protocol or what do you do beforehand?
We like to document everything, so we like to document what the room looks like before we search it. So we take pictures of pretty much everything in the room, starting from the entry point, either a house or a room, starting from the entry point in, and then every room and kind of every corner or anything that looks significant. We like to take pictures of that before we search it.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm going to show you what's been marked States Exhibits 59 through 64. Can you look through those photos, please?
Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to look at those photos?
Yes.
Okay, and are those photos taken of that room 128
Yes.
and inside of it?
Yes.
This time, I would offer States Exhibits 59 through 64.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
All right. States Exhibits 59 through 64 are admitted.
I'll start with 59, if I could publish, Your Honor.
You may.
Describe what that photo is taken of.
So that's a picture of the door from the outside, the hallway looking towards the door. Room, just documenting the room number.
We'll move to photo 60. And would you describe what we're observing here?
Sure. On the, it's kind of a smaller table on the corner of the hotel room, we found this printout, just hotel registration, what it appeared to be, and it has Mr. Whaley's name on it.
So that would help identify him as the person who purchased this room?
Yes.
We'll move to 61. Would you please describe what we're observing?
That's just a overall picture of the room before we begin to search it.
We'll look at 62. Is this also just items that you put on the bed just as an overview of the room at 128?
Yes, that's a picture of some of the items we found on the bed, and then some of the...
Excuse me, let me just ask you this. So they were just placed on the bed then, and then you took a picture of that?
Correct.
We'll move on to the next photo, which would be 63. Can you describe what that would be?
It's a new cell phone, or appear to be a new cell phone case, or the packaging, as if you would just buy a cell phone and that'd be the packaging that came in.
And again, is that one of the items that you ended up collecting in this matter? Or did you just take a photograph?
I think we
of it?
just took a photo of that. I don't believe we took the actual case. I'd have to double check.
We'll move on to Exhibit 64. And what would that be a picture of?
That's a picture of a receipt that I found that was lying on the bed.
And do you know the significance of why you would have kept that receipt then?
What stood out to me was that there was a purchase, it's listed there, of ammunition from the store, and then also the date. It was with the night before, I believe. So just from the information I've been provided of kind of what the overall of the investigation, that was significant, so.
And that's the receipt. Just to the right there, what would that be?
That's a cell phone also that we found lying on top of the bed.
And that looks like a cell phone that has a case on top of it that looks broken or busted up. Is that correct?
Yes.
Just to ask you one other question of the receipt, if you would look at the photograph there.
Sure.
What time is on that receipt when those items were purchased?
It gives a military time, and it looks like a date of 12/1/16, and then also a time of 1937.
And in our time, or non-military time, what would that be?
That'd be 7:37 p.m.
And that would be the time that this item would have been purchased?
Yes.
It also has some type of a site on there. Was that actually purchased, or was that deleted out?
Yeah, that was also interesting. There's a laser sight, but then above it says avoided entry, so, and then the minus of the cost of it, so assuming that they did not buy that.
So there was, on that receipt, there was a phone that was purchased and also ammunition, is that correct?
Yes.
Or just ammunition on that Walmart receipt?
Yes, the phone was underneath the receipt.
Now, the pertinent evidence in this case, did you then take that to the Mason City Police Department?
Yes, I did.
And they would have logged it in and kept that as evidence at the Mason City Police Department?
Actually, I logged it in and then put it into storage.
The other items that we saw on the bed and so forth, did you give those back to Deb then, Deb Ewing?
Yes, we, hotel staff asked us what they wanted us to do with it, and we collected it all up and brought it to the police department, met with her later and gave it to her.
I don't have anything further. Thank you, sir.
Cross-examination.
Thank you. Good morning, officer.
Good morning.
May I direct your attention to State's Exhibit 60 for just a moment?
Sure.
That's the days in receipt, is that right?
Yes.
If you look at that, do you see a date and time indicated on that?
Yes, I do.
What is the date and time that you see?
I just see a date. I do see a time, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Can you tell us the date and time that you see?
There's a printed date of 12/1/2016, and then a time of 9:42 p.m.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Redirect.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
May this witness be excused.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, thank
All
you.
right, you can step down, you're free to go. Thank you,
sir.
officer.
Thank you.
State may call its next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state would call Investigator Terrence Prohaska to the stand.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be giving the court will be the truth?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. You can have a seat. Sir, can I have you collect up the photographs that are there, and I'll take those at this time. All right. If you would, thank you, Mr. Hanrahan. All right. Counsel, you may proceed.
Please introduce yourself to the jury.
My name is Investigator Terrence Prohaska of the Mason City Police Department. I'm a criminal investigator for the Mason City Police.
And for the record, would you spell your first and last name?
Terrence, Terrance. My last name is Prochaska.
Investigator Prohaska, how long have you been with the Mason City Police Department?
I'll be 16 years in April.
And you're currently an investigator?
Yes, sir.
How long have you been an investigator?
A little over 6 years.
What are some of your duties or responsibilities as an investigator?
I follow up and investigate crimes that our uniformed patrol guys can't do. I have special training in death investigation, along with sex assault, robbery, and general financial crime theft.
Where did you obtain, or how did you obtain that special training?
Through various sources, through the Division of Criminal Investigation, along with different police agencies throughout the years.
Did you have any law enforcement experience prior to starting at Mason City?
Yes, sir.
Where did you work?
I was a police officer for the Makokata Police Department in eastern Iowa.
Any post-high school education prior to going into law enforcement?
Yes, I attended technician. I worked for an ambulance service, and then I was a jailer, and then I became a police officer in Makokata, and then came to Mason City, Iowa, where I've been ever since.
Investigator Prohaska, I want to turn your attention to December 2nd of last year. Did you get called in on this case?
Yes, sir.
Do you know about what time you would have arrived at the Mason City Police Department?
About 4:15 or so, a little after 4.
When you arrived at the police department, did you meet with any officers?
Yes, sir. Officer, their third shift patrolman, Tylen, and third shift patrolwoman, Barr.
So when you met with those officers, did you sit down and have a detailed discussion with them about what happened?
No, we just met in the hallway. Things were very busy, obviously, and I had them both brief me on what they knew in a brief synopsis of what happened.
Explain to the jury, in a case like this, where there's been a shooting and you're called in, who's making the decisions? Is somebody assigned to the case?
Yes, I have a lieutenant. His name's Rich Jensen. He's our boss. That's who initially gets the calls. It's similar to a dispatcher almost for us. Once they get that call from the police officers that are on scene, they get a short briefing. Our boss, who's at home in the middle of the night, will then give us a call at home and say, you need to go in and investigate whatever type of crime it is. Typically, he'll place somebody in charge and basically assigned to the case, and that would be me. And my responsibilities include basically keeping track of what everybody's doing, primarily making sure that somebody's at the crime scene, somebody's with witnesses, and somebody's doing interviews, and And then throughout the case, throughout the next few months, making sure that things are collected properly.
So the case was assigned to you then?
Yes, sir.
And when it was assigned to you, are you initially going through and deciding what resources you have?
Yes, we basically try to get as many men and women in to help us, and then at that point, my boss makes decisions on who goes where, and my lieutenant wanted me to interview a couple of witnesses.
So your lieutenant tells you, or I guess tells you is probably the way to put it, that he wants you to interview some witnesses. Before you interview those witnesses, are you able to go to the crime scene and look at the scene and get an overall picture of it?
No, I'm strictly at the police department, where the officers had brought in one witness, a female witness. Her name was Deb Ewing, and then also the suspect, which his name is Larry Whaley.
And so you were asked to interview, were you assigned to interview someone first?
Yes, I was assigned to interview Deb as she was in the outside kind of a waiting room area where we have at the police department.
So then you went in and did you interview Deb Ewing?
Yes, sir.
This was all at the Mason City Police Department?
Yes,
do you
sir.
have special rooms, or interview rooms that you do this in, or how does that all work?
Yeah, we have 3 interview rooms in the police department. 2 are kind of what you see on TV, block walls. There's nothing in them besides a camera on the wall and a table and a couple chairs. Typically what you see on crime movies and things. We also have one that's called the soft interview room. It's got more comfy chairs. It's got a window, and there's toys and magazines and things like that. We typically use a soft interview room for when a victim or somebody comes in that we don't really want them to feel pressured that they're in containment or anything. So.
And in this case, do you remember which room you would have interviewed Deb Ewing?
Yes, she was in the soft interview room.
And you did conduct that interview?
Yes, sir.
So now, prior going to that to doing her interview, you had talked to, you mentioned a couple law enforcement officers?
Yes, Officer Barr and Officer Tylen.
And after talking to Officer Barr and Tylen, you had a little bit of an idea what was happening?
Yes, sir.
So after you interviewed Ms. Ewing, do you go back and talk to additional officers to see if they have obtained new information?
Yes, I typically try to contact the officers that are on scene. And that's what I did with after I interviewed Ms. Ewing, and just gave them a brief update on what I had learned during that process. That helps the officers that are on scene with looking for what things that they may not know what happened, and helps them find things. For example, if there's a specific mark on a wall where they wouldn't notice it, but I was told by Ms. Ewing it would be easier for them to find. That's just an example. That's nothing she said.
Oh, so what you do is after you get this information, you share it with officers at the scene?
Yes, sir.
And may or may not help them at the scene?
Correct.
At the same time, without getting into what they told you, do officers share information they learn at the scene with you?
Yes, sir.
And every case is different, obviously, but the goal is to get as much information as you can?
Correct.
And since you're assigned to the case, do you at this point start directing people what to do before you finish both interviews?
Most of our investigators are trained to know automatically what they need to be doing, as long as we just give them a general area. I'm briefed right away on where everybody's at. So, for example, if there's somebody outside the house and I'm told by a witness that there's a piece of evidence laying out in the yard, I'll leave the interview room and call and say, hey, I just got told that there's a piece of evidence maybe in the mailbox or something. This is all examples. And it helps us flow to make sure that we don't miss anything, and time is always of the essence. So if I learn something right away and it's very important, I'll step out, brief them on what they need to be looking for. Or if it's not important, something that's not going to move, say for instance a hole in a wall or something, I'll wait until I'm done.
And while you're conducting an interview, at points do you take breaks during an interview?
Yes, sir.
And the purpose of the break, is there multiple reasons?
Yeah, 2 reasons. First of all, this fatigue. After you talk to somebody, if most of you are familiar with, if you've ever been questioned or you talk to your kids, if you sit there and for a very long period of time. A lot of times you start to go nowhere, so it's good to kind of break that up. It also gives me a chance to kind of reset and go over what I've learned and maybe have some follow-up questions.
So some of the breaks, you may contact other law enforcement officers to see if they have additional information that may help you go back into the interview room.
Yes, sir. I'll also offer the person I'm interviewing some beverages or some food, things like that, to keep them comfortable as well.
May we approach, Your Honor?
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we will take our lunch break now. Start just a little bit early. Ask that you come back ready to hear the rest of Investigator Prohaska's testimony after lunch. Over the lunch hour, please keep the admonition in mind. You have heard more evidence, not heard it all yet. So keep an open mind. Avoid any discussions between yourselves or with other people about this case. And please be very careful to avoid any outside sources of information. We want to make sure that when the time does come for you to deliberate, your decision is going to be based only on what you've seen and heard here in the courtroom. With that reminder, I'll ask the courtroom to stand for the jury. We'll see you back at 1 o'clock. You can sit down, sir. We're off the record. Counsel, we'll start our lunch break. If there's something that we need to address before we start up with the witnesses this afternoon, let me know. We can make our record, say at 1:15 before the jury comes back in. So, thank you.
Thank you.